Welcome back, everybody. I'm Rosemary Heileman. I'm co-chair of Issues and Advocacy along with Jean Pierce. And we want to thank our interpreters today, Vera Marie Baldoza and Sheila Kettering, as part of our effort to make our presentations more accessible. And we have also activated the subtitle feature. So if you didn't see this morning, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a box that says live transcript. It has two little C's, or you might be under more. And if you click on that, you'll see an opportunity to show the subtitles for the presentation. Or if you don't want to have the subtitles and they're showing, you can just hit hide. And if you'd like to adjust the size of the subtitles, just click on subtitle settings and you will see a screen where you can change the size by moving the little dot. So I hope that that is helpful to some of you. Now I'd like to introduce Jean Pierce, co-chairman of Issues and Advocacy, League of Women Voters of Illinois.
Good morning. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Illinois program, Redistricting in 2021. Community mapping. How can we, the people, influence the way district boundaries are drawn for our local, state, and federal legislative bodies? The link that you clicked on will be open all morning. So if for some reason you get disconnected, just click on it again. We will be recording this session. It'll be available on the League's website. While our speakers are talking, we invite you to click on chat at the bottom of your screen and type in your own questions. Issue Specialist Jane Ballingy will be monitoring the chat. Also, if you would like to be part of the League's Google group for redistricting, please type your email in the chat. Now, I welcome Issue Specialist Paula Lawson, who will introduce our speakers.
In the screen.
Yeah.
There she is. Good morning. Okay, I will introduce all three of our speakers. They are Ryan Talley, Jason Rode, and Michael Daniel. And after their introductions, they will all do their presentations before we have questions. Ryan Talley leads policy development and advocacy efforts for good government reform on a state, city, and county level for Change Illinois. He oversees the creation and execution of Change's policy agenda. Prior to working for Change Illinois, Ryan directed grassroots initiatives and advocacy efforts for the Small Business Advocacy Council, giving small business community a voice on federal, state, and local government levels. Ryan's success at the SBAC in passing bipartisan legislation resulted in his appointment to the Leadership Council of the National Small Business Association. Jason Rode is the national coordinator of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. His principal tasks include facilitating partnerships, coordinating communications, and spreading the tools generated by the project. His goal is to empower communities and the general public by sharing project innovations. Before joining PGP, Jason worked as a journalist on several platforms, most notably Salon Magazine. Jason holds master's degrees from Texas Tech and from the University of North Texas. As the strategy coordinator of Representable, Michael Daniel develops relationships with organizations, helps create educational materials, and plans long-term strategies to support underrepresented communities across the country with the Representable redistricting tool. A senior in the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University, Michaela is passionate about public service. She has led activist campaigns, promoted civic understanding, and conducted research to support those campaigns. With her interests in government policy, Michaela is excited to continue her passion for public service through this work to promote fair redistricting. We are proud to welcome you to the League's webinar today. The presentation will include about 30 to 35 minutes. It will be Ryan Talley will be giving the update on plans for redistricting of state legislative maps and for the setup of the commission for creating ward maps in the city of Chicago. Then Jason will speak, followed by Michaela. They will be talking about how to use the We Draw the Maps community mapping tool. Ryan will again follow them and we'll talk about how maps created by the mapping tool can be used for advocacy. Again, there will be time for questions at the end, and please put your questions in the chat. Go ahead. Ryan, will you please start?
Great. Thank you, Paula. I appreciate the introduction, and let me get my screen up here. All right. It's great to be here again with everyone, and thanks for hopping on for this presentation. So for the first part, I'll talk briefly about the state and Chicago remap. I know a lot of folks on the call also might be interested in county remapping or mapping in other municipalities, which I'll touch on later. But what we have coming up here for the state map, which state lawmakers also will oversee the redistricting of constitution or federal districts as well as the state legislative districts. So real briefly, the process for that is that lawmakers have until June 30th, 2021 to finalize a map with the governor. If that map is not approved, a backup commission of 8 members is selected, and that partisan split commission has until August 10th, 2021 to file a map. If that map is not filed, there's 2 names that will be pulled out of the hat, either a Democrat or Republican, and they will become the tie-breaking member of this commission. And if they cannot agree upon a map by October 5th, 2021, the state Supreme Court will have to decide on a remedy for our state legislative maps. And so I did want to touch on this briefly because it's a lot of the talking points today are around the census delay and what that means for the Illinois remap. And there's really 3 options we see that lawmakers could take to account for these delays. The legislature could wait for the 2020 census data, which is expected by September 30th rather than the March 31st date we typically get it. And they could wait, and that potentially means that a backup commission or the state Supreme Court would be overseeing this remap process. Or the state legislature could pass a preliminary map and readjust that proposal once the new census data becomes available. And the last thing that has been considered is delaying our primary elections and also asking the courts to delay constitutional remapping deadlines, given that September 30th, if we get the date that late, will run into the petition filing to run for office for the 2022 elections. And so where are things in Springfield now? As far as it goes for reform, we have a newly elected House Speaker, Chris Welch. He has in the past supported proposals for independent commissions, and he recently reaffirmed his support for fair maps. For Governor Pritzker, he, while campaigning, said we need an independent commission, but since taking office has only said he would veto a gerrymandered or partisan map. And we haven't heard a whole lot publicly from Senate President Harmon since he's been elected Senate President, but that leaves us right now with lawmakers will be in control of this process this year. And so the Senate has went ahead and established a redistricting committee chaired by Senator Omar Aquino, and the minority spokesman is Republican Senator Jason Berkman. The House has yet to establish a redistricting committee, but from conversations, we anticipate that they may start holding public hearings to solicit input around early April. And that's around the same timeline that they took public input in 2011. And so Change Illinois has introduced a bill, HB 3581, to create the Redistricting Transparency Act. This would require a minimum of 35 public hearings for folks to weigh in. And those hearings would have to be live streamed. They would have to have language access. They would, when people are submitting maps to this commission, they would have to respond to those. And then it also prioritizes fairness standards for map making and really putting an emphasis on the Federal Voting Rights Act to ensure that we protect minority representation in the state of Illinois. It also requires a compliance report with map proposals to show how map makers met the requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act and the Illinois Voting Rights Act. It also requires that they hold public hearings when between when a map proposal is introduced and when they're actually going to take a vote. So that gives the public the ability to weigh in on the map proposal before they take a final vote on it. And then it would require the Senate and the House to to form a joint committee to work on redistricting. And really this would help the public because you wouldn't have to be going to House hearings and Senate hearings to testify on essentially the same districts, given House districts fit neatly into Senate districts in Illinois. And so for the Chicago remapping process, it works a little differently. Map makers in the city, which is the city council, have until December 1st, 2020 to pass a map, and they have to do that by 41 votes, or 10 aldermen can introduce a substitute ordinance. And for Change Illinois, we're working on creating a redistricting advisory commission made of 13 Chicagoans. We are currently putting together a selection committee of independent members to select 13 members that reflect the diversity of our city. And they would work on a proposal which we could introduce into city council. And if there's two proposals that get more than 10 votes in city council, we would have those two map proposals would go before voters to choose. So it wouldn't be dependent on just city council to decide the fate of the ward maps. Chicagoans could really have a say in what their ward maps are going to look like. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jason and Michaela to talk a little bit more about community mapping and how you can use some of these great resources they have available.
Ryan, thank you so much. And I'm very glad to be here with everybody so far. We are, like I said, honored to be here. My part is the shortest, I promise. We are the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. We're here at Princeton University. Our story really begins a couple of years ago when the neuroscientist Sam Wong started doing quantitative analysis of polls. And he noticed something funny, that despite polls being plentiful and regularly favoring one political party, they didn't win in the election, the national election. He wondered why this was, and he found out what many have before and since, that gerrymandering is a significant problem. So he decided that he could put together a team here at Princeton of various experts that would fight against gerrymandering. We operate primarily in three fields. The first is math and data. We can analyze a gerrymandered map, we can look at demographics, we can compile precinct data, and we can, we believe, show with some certainty that a place has been gerrymandered. We also work in the field of law. We have a legal team that analyzes statutes, what governments are doing, advocacy, and files amicus curiae briefs. Finally, we have outreach, which is what I do, where we focus on building networks and connecting partners, hopefully helping people in multiple states. A really special part of what we do is Representable. Representable began several years ago when a group of gifted Princeton engineers decided that they could make a real difference by creating a piece of software for everybody that would fight against gerrymandering by using community of interest data. And so with that said, it is both my pleasure and my honor to turn it over to Michaela Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. Like Jason said, Representable started when students realized that there was a fundamental problem in democracy. People from underserved communities especially were unable to represent themselves during the redistricting process. So the whole goal of this tool is to increase public input by providing an easy way for everyone and anyone to learn about redistricting, gerrymandering, and communities of interest, give valuable testimony about their community of interest, map their community of interest, and then send this information to map makers, organizers, and the like, and all in about 10 minutes. So today I'll be walking you through the website and the tool itself, both as a user and as an organization. So I will go ahead and start by sharing my screen. This is the website. When you type in www.representable.org, it's what you'll see. So everyone can click on Get Started. This is our landing page. Like I said, we really want somebody who has no idea what reapportionment is, what gerrymandering is, to be able to use the tool to its fullest extent. So we're telling them that the reason that they're here today is to map their community and identify its shared interests so that public officials can take their community's concerns into account. We then define the problem. It's gerrymandering, and we give a very brief overview. It's when politicians have split up or packed together communities into districts that silence their voices. We also have a video here, which includes subtitles, so people can learn more about gerrymandering, redistricting, communities of interest, and how Representable can help. Next, people will collect their state to get started. Today, I'm going to map my community in Georgia so that I can show you to its fullest extent how mapping your community will work. Every state has this state page. It's an explanation of what is redistricting, what it looks like in your state, and how Representable can help. We also present criteria on what redistricting looks like for your state. Here we learned that in Georgia, communities of interest must be considered when our legislators are redrawing the lines. We then define communities of interest. Some states are very specific. My state is not, so we give the general definition. A community of interest is typically a population that shares cultural, historical, or economic interests. They do not necessarily share the same political viewpoints or support certain candidates or political parties. So now that I learned all about redistricting and what a community of interest is and redistricting criteria, I'm ready to make my map. Before users start, we have them sign up, which is just simply an email and password, an email that is later going to be confirmed, just so that we can cut down on illegitimate submissions. I've already made an account, so. Here we are at step 1 of the mapping process. It's identifying information, and we explain that we are not collecting data for any nefarious purposes, nor are we selling data. We just simply want to cut down on illegitimate submissions. Later, when I explain what a community mapping drive is, when you collect maps in aggregate, I'll explain how you can also choose not to collect addresses if you are working with a community who does not feel comfortable giving that information. But for our purposes today, I'll just go ahead and put down my address. So, right before people enter into the testimony and mapping process, we want to orient them again. What you're doing today is mapping your community of interest. We give the definition again about what a community of interest is, and now we're including some examples. It's your neighborhood or the area that you live in. It's the people you would like to choose representatives with, or even a local group that is brought together by a common interest. So now that all of that orienting is done, we have people tell us a bit about their community before they start mapping. But we don't just leave users flapping in the wind. We give them some guiding questions, some examples, and an example testimony as well. For the sake of time today, I'm just going to copy paste what I have written before. So in terms of economic and environmental interests, and answering where are residents employed, and if there are environmental concerns in your community, what are they? I say that my community struggles with unemployment. Most people work in the city being Atlanta. However, we have a weak transportation system. There's a park and ride, and here I get very specific, it's on Panola Road, but the buses don't go through the neighborhoods to take people there. So it's a problem that everyone in my community struggles with. And then additionally, a lot of people work at Stonecrest Mall. It's a uniting factor. A lot of teenagers, such as myself, had our first jobs at the mall. In terms of community activities and services, we ask users, where do people in your community gather or socialize? How and where does your community access services? So for me, I talk about, once again, the mall. It's where most people gather on the weekends. And in addition to that, church is a really important part of our community. We're from the Bible Belt. So I talk about two churches in particular, Beulah and New Birth, who provide services such as food, childcare, and healthcare. And then speaking of healthcare, in times of emergency, most people in my neighborhood go to DeKalb Medical Center. It's a really important part of my community as well. Most people my generation were born there. In terms of cultural or historical interests, what are the cultural bonds of your community? And if your community has a shared history, what is it? So I talk about how my community is predominantly Black and has an aging population, though in recent years, there has been an influx of new residents. And then lastly, in this box, it is very vague on purpose. In general, what should politicians know about your community? What are the needs of your community? Is there anything else you want to say? When you're hosting a community mapping drive, you could ask people to be specific. Let's say you know that one town is going to be split up 4 different ways. If you get 100 maps of people saying, we don't think that our community should be split 4 different ways, that can be very powerful in the redistricting process. But for me, I decided to talk about policy. So education is really important to my community. The schools surrounding my community have been on the failing list for a bit over a decade. And so it also mobilized my community. About a few years ago, the state decided that they were going to consider subverting school boards and taking over schools that weren't performing to a certain caliber. It was the first time in my life I saw people writing op-eds, going to town halls, planning protests. It was really a uniting factor for my community, which is why I talk about it. And then I make a suggestion that we needed to be in a single state Senate district so that one person can fight for our kids. So now that I have thought very deeply about who's in my community, what are our values, what unites us, do we have a common history, what services do we use, I'm ready to start mapping. So I'll name it Michaela's Home. And here we are on the mapping page. This little square is just explaining that what you're going to do is map with census block groups. These are the units that most map breakers use when they're drawing voting districts. But today, remember, we're just making our community of interest. We can start by entering a zip code, address, or landmark. I'll start with a zip code. Some features of the mapping page, if I click community information, I can see the testimony I just wrote. I can also see community population. As I click census block groups, community population will increase. I can also use this gear in the top right corner to erase census block groups that I have chosen, or to make the selection tool size bigger. And then if users don't have a Michaela to guide them through the process, they can click this question mark in the top left corner, and there's a video that shows them how to use the tool, and we have an FAQ available to them. Very quickly today, I'm going to first erase because I think this is way too big. And I will enter in a landmark. I said that education was really important to my community, so I will put in the local high school. There we go. So I definitely want to include that in my community. Let me zoom in. I can see grocery stores. Like everyone goes to the local Publix. Panola Road, that's where the park and ride is, which I talked about in my testimony. I'll go east because there's DeKalb Medical Center, which I also talked about in my testimony. I can see another high school that's very important, Miller Grove. I'll keep going east because it actually originally zoomed right in on the mall. You can see the Sears and the Dillards. That's Stonecrest, which I said was economically and socially important to my community. It's not contiguous, which is why it's giving me the red, but now it is. So now that I've included all the landmarks I talked about, it spans 2 cities, but I'm not concerned. Up until like 5 or 6 years ago, Lithonia and Stonecrest were actually the same city. It's not too close to the perimeter of Atlanta because I feel like those communities have different services, for example. And then the population I can see is 36,000, and I do not believe that is too big. So with that, I will go ahead and click the privacy and terms of use, essentially once again telling you what we're doing with your email address. And then one last important feature is that once you submit a community, it is final. You cannot edit that community. What you can do is see your community in My Communities, which is under My Account, and then you can delete it and make a new one. You can have multiple communities at one time, so you are not tied to only making 5 communities, for example. So I will click the reCAPTCHA and submit my map. Let's see. So now here we are on the submission page. We are very action oriented. We want users to do something with the map they just drew. They can export it as a PDF, send it to their legislator, who they can find here. They can send it to their local redistricting commission if your state has one, or you can send it to your local League of Women Voters. You can export your map as a GeoJSON file, which is kind of the industry standard for mapping. And your community of interest and GeoJSON file could be uploaded to softwares such as Maptitude, Dave's Redistricting app, District R, or Esri. And then lastly, when you make your community, you do receive a confirmation email, and you could resend that email here, send it to your colleagues, your friends, your family, and etc. On this page, it's going to zoom in one more time. You can see your community of interest in conversation with several data layers, including, but not limited to, congressional districts, state house districts, 5-digit postcode areas, and school districts. Yep. And counties. And here are some state house districts. And you can see how your community of interest intersects with those. Lastly, you can see your testimony on the left-hand side. Your testimony is also exported when you export your map. And you can see the demographics. Right now, it is just population, but we are working to incorporate ACS data so that people can see that demographic information in conversation with the community that they drew. And you can export your community as a CSV file, but that is coordinates primarily. So with that, I'm going to very quickly take you to how an organization can use Representable. So if you were to go on the website right now, you would see the button here would be partners. You would click that button, essentially put in a description, the state that you're operating in, and the name of your organization, and then you would be given a dashboard such as this. You can manage your membership or add several people onto your organization's dashboard. These are the only people who will be able to see the maps submitted to your organization. Speaking of maps submitted to your organization, you collect maps in aggregate through creating a community mapping drive, which is what our partners, Change Illinois, have done. When you create a community mapping drive, a new page on your dashboard will look like this: a description of the drive, the state the drive is operating in, and the name of the drive. You will be given a unique link, which you send to people who you'd like to contribute to your drive. And when they click the link, they will get a page that looks something like this: a general overview of Representable, an overview of the community mapping drive. This is the one for Change Illinois. It will give an overview of redistricting in your state. Here, it is Illinois. And then the definition of communities of interest in your state. People will then click Draw My Community and go through the exact same process I just walked you through. And with that, you can see all of the maps at one time here. You can see the testimony that people gave and hop over to all of the communities. When there are a lot of communities in a small area, such as we have demonstrated here in North Carolina, they are opaque. You can also see them in conversation with several data layers, such as state senate districts, state house districts, counties, and the like. And you can export all of these maps and their testimonies in GeoJSON file or a CSV file. And we always tell organizations Representable is not your main software to do analysis with, nor is it your main software to build districts, for example, based on this COI data. It is a wonderful tool to educate users from all backgrounds regarding redistricting, gerrymandering, and communities of interest, get their testimony and their maps, and then export those maps to another software such as Maptitude as Redistrict R, so that you can actually act upon those maps if you so choose. Some last features to know about the website is that we have a lot of educational materials in the form of FAQs, a redistricting glossary, and a resources page, which includes a demo video, such as the demo I just gave you today. And then the website is actually translated into Spanish and Arabic, so non-English speaking communities can also map their communities and get their testimony. And with that, that is the site.
Great, thank you, Michaela. I will talk a little bit more about here in Illinois, how we can use tools like this in order to ensure that we're advocating for our community, and then we'll open it up for questions. So when you're thinking about mapping your community, there's a lot of great ways to really make sure that you're being a voice for your community and, talking to the right folks and putting the right public pressure on. So this may, as you're doing this, you really want to decide you can even do it after you map your community, but decide after you have your community map, what level of government you're looking to focus on, whether that's federal, state, or local maps. That may be for county maps, that may be for local municipalities. And then after you have your community mapped, you can, as Michaela showed, you can see that where it lies within certain Senate districts, House districts, and you could talk to the elected officials that are currently representing those areas and talk to them about how your needs could be met better through the upcoming remap. As I spoke about earlier, there will be public hearings available for folks to attend. So that is also something that I encourage everyone to take advantage of, especially if you're having trouble meeting with elected officials in your area. These public hearings are an opportunity to say, hey, this is my community. This is what is important, valuable about it. This is why we should be kept together in a single district. And then there's also tools like letters to the editor. This may be an awareness building tool for other members in your community that you haven't had a chance to sit down with, so they can see, what's being discussed in a particular area. This may be to put pressure on elected officials to, ensure that your community isn't broken up to multiple districts. And then you could also host training sessions with your local community to build consensus. One of the things that can become very powerful for this is if you're reaching out to a lot of different folks in the community and there's large consensus, there's power in numbers and what you can be able to do to influence maps that are being drawn by lawmakers. And Change Illinois has been doing some sessions around the state and talking to folks about how to map, and then ensuring that they have the tools and resources available to them to be effective advocates for their community during the remap. As I mentioned earlier, the state remap, we are likely to see public hearings start around April. So now's a great time to start thinking about what your community looks like, so you could be prepared to advocate for your community then. For local redistricting, the timelines do work a little different. So that is something to pay attention to. There's not the same time constraints of June 30th for your county officials to get a map done. So you do have a little more time, but it's important to go ahead and start being prepared, because it is one of those things, if you're not advocating for your community, it may get overlooked just because no one was there saying this community is important, it needs to be held together. So using tools like Representable can really be a powerful way to be effective advocates for your community. With that, I believe I'm handing it over to Paula for questions.
Right. I think we can probably put all the panelists on just in case we go from one subject to the other. So I'll ask a couple questions and then Jane will take them from the chat. So the complete US Census data is scheduled to be released the end of September, well after the date in the Illinois Constitution for the General Assembly to draw the required maps. So what can we do to ensure that communities are represented fairly?
Yeah, that is a very important question. And I think one, starting to work on mapping your community, and if you're interested in mapping districts, to go ahead and do that now. I think it may be one of the things you want to make sure that, if moving the primary election back or delaying some of the constitutional deadlines are important, to start advocating for those things. At Change, we've had some discussions. We haven't taken a position yet on that, but we do know that there will likely be public hearings, and being involved in those are really important. Having the discussions with your lawmakers now on what your community is and why it's important is monumental, ensuring that your community's voice isn't suppressed or neglected.
Okay. And this happened to be in the chat, but it's kind of a follow-up. Is there a public path for advocacy for an independent commission? Do you see anything at this time?
I don't. The League of Women Voters and Change Illinois both for a long time worked on an independent commission at the state level. In order to take that responsibility away from members of the General Assembly, we need to amend the Constitution, and the earliest we could get on the ballot to do that would be 2022. So it's likely that there's just no shot for that for this year's remap. I know there's a Republican-led bill in the House of Representatives that has this mechanism, but I had concerns just that process is unconstitutional because the state constitution is pretty specific that General Assembly retains control over the map making power.
Okay. I think before I forget, there was something in the chat asking about follow-up. And I will be sending information to whoever signs up for the Redistricting Google group, and we can assess what kind of follow-up we'd like to do on the mapping project, and we'll arrange to do that. So Jane, do you have some questions you wanted from the chat that you wanted to ask?
The community managers are not necessary. There's a question, can a computer program draw district lines to ensure equity and non-bias?
I can take this, and Jason, Michaela, feel free to jump in too. I don't think so. A lot of with redistricting, there's a lot of nuances on what makes communities up that you really can't see through algorithms or computer programs. And so this is why at Change Illinois, we've been very focused on ensuring that there's opportunities for the public to have input on this process and make sure that they can talk through some of these things. It may, when you're looking at a map, it may look like it makes sense to put lines in certain spots, but if you're talking to the local communities, they may say that would be detrimental to their representation. A lot of the representable presentations I've been doing with counties in Illinois that I really have never been to before, I could look at that county on a map and say, this looks like it would make sense for it. And then I talk to those local folks there, and what they tell me is vastly different from what I could say looks like sense on the map, or putting it, just dividing the state up equally population wise.
Okay, there are going to be a lot of questions. How does fair maps differ? How is it different from representable? Fair maps being, quote, the way we worked on it before, and they're really asking the question, I think, of how would this impact the fair maps and concept? I hope I said that right.
Well, I'll let Jason jump in with a little more just on, or Michaela on representable, but Fair Maps was a legislative effort to put the redistricting process in the hands of an independent commission. Given that we are past the constitutional deadline to do that for this year's remapping, we are using tools like representable to ensure folks can advocate and talk about their communities to lawmakers who will retain control of this year's remap.
That's perfectly put. The only thing I would add to that is that representable is a tool being used in multiple states, one of which is Illinois. And we tailor it for each state, but it's different from the Fair Maps Initiative, which is an organization, and we are a tool and organization.
We have this question: if all the blue states embrace these high standards, but the red states don't, won't this hurt one party?
I wouldn't necessarily say so. In our legislative proposal that I walked through briefly in my presentation, we're saying that things like the federal voting rights should be prioritized for map drawers, and that's really ensuring equitable representation in the state of Illinois. Again, I think for advocates like us, it's really not a party issue. It's a issue about who's in control of the map making and ensuring that the end product of that, whoever retains control of it, that the maps are equitable, that the maps that are being made are responsive to community needs and being led by community input, rather than by incumbents that may have personal interest in retaining their seats through the remap or re-solidifying their chances of getting reelected as an individual, regardless of what party they're in.
I would say that gerrymandering is a poison to our democracy. We don't like it when anybody does it. And what has happened in the United States is that one party has the chance to, they gerrymander, it goes on. And then when the next party gets in power, they get a chance to gerrymander as well, right? Happens all the time. It's bad when anybody does it. And as for the red states and the blue states, suppose that every blue state decides to pass transparency laws and commissions, et cetera. If that's the case, this is the way I think a lot of state reform works. The states are the laboratories of democracy. California has a commission, and the change there in their electoral system since the commission was established about 10 years ago has been nothing short of remarkable, right? States that have a chance to change should pursue that change, in our view.
Okay, they keep moving up the line. I find one and they've moved on. Here's one I think is pretty good. Is there a way to consider significant geographic and built barriers? For example, two counties whose boundary is a river with only one bridge across it on the 20-mile boundary, or a Chicago ward split by the Eisenhower.
I would say, for things like that, it's really on a community by community basis. Kind of the example I gave earlier, I was working with a rural community in Whiteside County on the western part of the state. And again, I could see the highway going through there, maybe think makes sense to split a district along that highway. And you talk to the residents there and they say, no, the folks on the south and north side of the highway have the same concerns, have the same needs from their lawmakers. So it needs to be put in, they believed it needed to be put in one district. You could have another example, like where I live in Chicago, there's a train line that splits, metro line that splits right south of me. And around here, there's a very big difference in the communities on the north and south side of that train track. Those two communities may decide that it's better to have the same representative, or they may say we have very different needs. So it's really community by community, and that is why it's so important for folks to take advantage of these resources available to them so that they can advocate for it, what they need.
Okay, let me go back up here a little bit, since we're getting a lot of questions. Which Chicago alderman are most interested in the Change Illinois project, whether they are for or against it?
Sure. I know that Alderman Maldonado, who happens to be my ward alderman here in the city, is strongly opposed publicly any type of commissions to do the remapping. Aldermans Vasquez and Hopkins introduced a resolution to have a debate in city council about independent commissions and the viability of those in the city of Chicago. So I think we'll start to see more of that publicly as we get closer to the remap. It's really not something that a ton have talked about prior to this year, but as with all things, once we kind of get close to the deadline, you'll start to see more public statements. But I do think there are a significant number of aldermen in the city of Chicago who have seen the damage done by backroom maps in past years and how that's hurt representation for communities. There's communities like Inglewood that have 7 aldermen. Logan Square, there's at least 4, maybe 5, depending on where you see the boundaries. And so, there are a number of aldermen have seen how this has hurt representation, seen how it's affected communities that really don't have a spokesperson or one alderman that really cares about that community's need.
How can the public take part in in realizing independent commission in Illinois?
I think our proposal that we have for the redistricting transparency, HB 3581, is a really good step for this year's remap. It increases transparency. It makes lawmakers accountable through a compliance report, ensuring that they are following standards like the Federal Voting Rights Act and showing the public how they're following those standards. And then it also requires for them to be more responsive to the public than in years past. I think, of course, after this remap, we'll have to see what the eventual results look like, but I think there's no plans that change to stop in the future pushing for an independent commission that can take control of this process, and we can see some of the benefits like Jason highlighted that California's seen since they've switched over to an independent commission being in control of their remap.
A question here is, what does the current legislative commission that does mapping, what tools do they use?
I guess if tools are talking about redistricting software, I'm not 100% sure. The House still has yet to establish a redistricting committee. The Senate just has appointed the chairman and the minority spokesperson, so they still haven't even released a full list of the committee members, but that's definitely something that we can stay on top of and make sure that we're sharing that information with everyone.
Who sets the population size for a district within a given state so that all districts have an equal voice?
That's largely defined by the census count, which we are still waiting on. So for state districts, each year, our number of state representatives and state senators don't change. So it would be taking the state's total population and trying to divide that evenly through 118 House districts and 59 Senate districts. And then for federal districts, of course, the apportionment numbers are expected to arrive in the next few months, and that will dictate how many members we have in Congress. That's some dependent on Illinois' total population compared to relative to other states' total population. So one of the things to kind of be careful about, it's when we talk about how many members for Congress we could have in Illinois, it not only matters, what Illinois' population is, but it's relative to the other states, because the total number of members in the House of Representatives in Congress each year doesn't change. It stays the same as well.
Okay. How will the fact that Illinois will lose at least one and maybe 2 rep districts federally affect the redistricting process? And again, this is going to be tied to the census.
Yep, we should know a definitive answer on how many congressional seats Illinois will have in the next few weeks. But it will mean that Illinois is going to be sending less members, meaning less influence on what Congress does in the next 10 years. It means that, you know, we won't have as significant of a voice on issues before Congress in the next 10 years.
Okay, let's see. It moves so fast. Oops, there I go. 2 more
Yeah,
minutes.
Jane, I have a couple. These are more like technical data things. So maybe representative, they want to know what type of census data are you using? So what data are you using in representable? And there was a question about prison gerrymandering. How is that taken into account? I don't know if your data takes that into account or not. So it's a data question.
Yeah, regarding the first question, we're using 2010 census data for the census block groups, and we will update the census block groups when that census data becomes available, which is up in the air. But when it does become available, it's not the most difficult engineering task to update them because census block groups do not vary greatly between census and census. And then in terms of that demographic data, which I mentioned would be a data layer in the future, we will be using ACS data because we plan on incorporating that data layer in the next 2 to 4 weeks. The second question regarding prison gerrymandering, we currently do not have a way to incorporate that. The problem with just prison gerrymandering is that people who are incarcerated are then given us the population of where the prison is located. But that is an interesting thought. So if you have any suggestions, I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat. Representable is a very malleable tool. We've actually added data layers such as school districts and Chicago wards specifically for partners and states that we're working in. So we're always very ready and able to hear suggestions that you may have.
I will mention on the prison gerrymandering front as well, a part of the criminal justice omnibus package that recently passed in Illinois, and into prison gerrymandering was a part of that. However, that law will not take effect until 2025, meaning that the reapportionment of those numbers cannot be used for the 2021 remap. So we won't see that reallocation in the next remap, but in 2031 and in future redistricting cycles, the Department of Corrections will be responsible for collecting information and submitting that to the State Board of Elections in order to ensure that remap takes an account where folks are incarcerated, their prior residence, and counting them there for redistricting purposes.
I'm going to do one last one, I think, because we're probably beginning to run out of time. It's an interesting question. Is there a charge for using the site? Would love to let government classes and schools get involved as well as our local league.
The site is free and it will forever be free. The whole ethos of the tool is that anyone and everyone can go in and map their community in an easy fashion. We're funded in part by Schmidt Futures and we're a partner with Princeton Gerrymandering Project, so no worries about that.
Okay, that's a good one. I don't know how much time we have left.
I think we've got about 3 or 4 minutes. So I see one here. It's a little bit longer. It says, please explain how communities can be represented when their population is low income and has primarily Black and Brown people. Who will speak for them? Why would they want to remain a subset? Wouldn't it be an advantage for them to be part of a larger group? Okay, there's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, I was looking for that one.
So if we have a population that's primarily Black and Brown, who should speak for them? And you know, what advantages for them to be in a subset of a group? Yeah. I don't know if Ryan can take that.
So I'll say for Change Illinois, we've been very intentional about reaching out to Black and Brown led organizations who are working within these communities, know the communities, and really to be a resource in saying, this is what, these are tools that you can use to empower your voice and be effective in advocating for your community. I think an important piece with, thinking about drawing community, it's also a way for you to make sure that your community isn't broken up. Your community may be, like, in some sense smaller as a part of a larger district, but you still have a stronger voice being what your community staying whole in one district, rather than a line going through the middle of your community or multiple lines where you're just a very tiny piece of 4 different districts. But that's why, public education is so important, making sure that we're being very intentional about outreach, ensuring that these voices are heard in the remap and not being overlooked or not being intentionally silenced.
And there is one, it's a comment more than a question. Thanking you for this and the walkthrough of how a district can be drafted in a consensus process. How do you go about do that? How do you find the community leaders and get their input and participation in this? And how do you choose who should be participating within your community for input? Big question.
I'll take a stab unless Jason or Michaela want to jump in. I don't think there's necessarily, I think there's wrong ways to do it. I don't think there's one size fits all for what the right way is to make sure that you're hearing, that everyone's having a say. I think bringing more folks to the table, bringing as many as you can to talk about it, they may show blind spots that, you have. For instance, I've lived in the same neighborhood in Chicago for 10 years. I have a pretty good idea of what, our community area would look like, but I would only benefit from going to the local community center, talking to folks there. I would only benefit from going to some of the local churches here and talking to community members within that faith and saying, what does this community look like to you? So I don't want that to come off as a limitation to folks to say, well, I need to talk to every single neighbor in order to draw a map out. I'm not trying to say that either, but it only will help you build a stronger community if you are soliciting input. And I would just, as far as like figuring out who to talk to, I would say just look at what the local activities are in your community, whether it's folks organizing, from a farmer's market to religious organizations, to community centers, to, maybe there's some local groups, like for instance, in my community that work on affordable housing, talking to their folks and seeing what the community looks like to them are some places you could start.
And I do say that Jason has put his email in there for further questions. So there will be in the information on it. I think that's the majority of the questions, Paula.
Yeah, and I was just wanted to say before Jean ends that we'll send out some information in our Google group, and we'll talk about the continuing with community mapping and have a chat about what League can do this spring to have our voice heard in the redistricting process.
So we truly appreciate our speakers today, Ms. Daniel, Mr. Rode, Mr. Talley, for joining us. I also want to thank all of our audience for staying engaged and informed. Again, if you're interested in follow-up training or mapping, or you would like to be part of the redistricting Google group, please put your email in the chat. Community mapping resources are posted on the League website. We'll post the recordings and any supplemental resources as well. Just go to LWVIL.org, scroll down to Issues Briefing, and click on Resources. If your questions were not addressed, please feel free to send them to issues@lwvil.org. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.